They kidnapped her son thinking she was just a helpless widow, a woman they could intimidate and control. But they had no idea this seemingly ordinary rancher had already laced their drinking water with a lethal, slow-acting poison. Get ready for an explosive showdown set against the gritty backdrop of Arizona's unforgiving frontier. This is the gripping tale of Martha Hargrave, a widow whose quiet demeanor masked the fierce heart of a warrior, a mother prepared to risk everything for family justice and honor. As tension escalates and the outlaw's bodies weaken from her hidden plan, you'll find yourself on the edge of your seat witnessing strategic brilliance and unstoppable courage. If you love classic Western vengeance stories like those of John Wayne and Clint Eastwood, you're going to love this action-packed saga. Subscribe now to our channel to ensure you don't miss stories filled with courage, honor, and old-school frontier justice. Harriet Morrow had learned to read trouble from a distance, a skill honed through years no one in Willow Bend suspected she possessed. On a scorching June afternoon in 1878, her gaze swept over the broad Arizona sky as she stood on the veranda of the modest ranch house she'd called home for the past half-year. The building, a resolute structure of weathered pine and adobe, had once belonged to her late husband Caleb. Now the land was all she had left except for her 19-year-old son Jonah. Anyone glancing her way would see a worn widow in her early 40s, hair bound loosely under a plain kerchief face lined by desert sun and grief. But behind Harriet's calm eyes, there was an alertness that suggested she'd known more than her fair share of war and hardship. Jonah was inside, hunched over some engineering sketches at the scarred kitchen table. He'd inherited his mother's clever mind, though his ambitions veered toward building windmills, mapping irrigation routes, and calculating water flow rather than the grim skills Harriet had once practiced. Before her move to Willow Bend, Harriet had left no clues that might hint at her background in battlefield medicine or her clandestine knowledge of poisons, knowledge she'd honed under the thunder of cannons and the moans of dying men. But the raw edge remained beneath her unassuming exterior, ready to surface if danger threatened the few things she still cherished. On that particular afternoon, she spotted movement at the edge of her property, a trio of mounted riders sporting rough leathers, the distinctive bandanas of the Iron Strike Raiders. Over the past 6 years, that gang had cut a swath of terror through the southwestern territories, their trail marked by intimidation, theft, and spilled blood. Led by a cunning, ruthless ex-Confederate officer named Barrett Lowe, the Raiders had mastered the art of squeezing ranchers for water rights and controlling trade routes. Harriet had heard rumors about them soon after returning to Willow Bend. She'd recognized how they systematically seized strategic springs, forced honest settlers to pay protection fees, and sabotaged law enforcement efforts through bribes or fear. A few months earlier, the Raiders had approached Harriet with a slimy offer to purchase her land for a fraction of its worth. Her place was uniquely positioned over the region's last clean well, one of the only fresh sources of water for miles. When she refused them, they didn't bother concealing their displeasure. Out here, violence was often a simpler language than legal documents. Now, seeing these riders scoping her ranch borders again brought Harriet's anxiety boiling up. Yet she didn't rush inside or reach for the carbine hidden in the barn. Instead, she raised a hand to shield her eyes from the sun, calmly watching from her porch while making herself appear every bit the exhausted frontier widow. Inside, Jonah paused his pencil mid-calculation. Even from within, he sensed the tension Harriet had told him before that the Iron Strike Raiders had grown bolder in the area. The local sheriff was of little help, friendly enough, but too easily cowed, especially with the Raiders' deep pockets. Jonah, idealistic and hopeful, wanted to rely on lawful means, believing that meticulously filed water rights claims and county records would protect them. Harriet had tempered his hope with warnings about the real cruelty men could inflict, especially men whose power depended on controlling a precious resource in a parched land. She knew better than most that a piece of paper was only as good as the gun ready to defend it. Harriet had tried to keep Jonah's focus on his engineering projects. She helped him draw up a formal claim to ensure no confusion about who owned the well. But an uneasy part of her recognized that such measures wouldn't dissuade men like Barrett Lowe for long, and Harriet was no stranger to dealing with violent opportunists. Memories flickered. She'd once been nicknamed the Angel of Merced Field, during the war saving lives on both sides with radical medical treatments. Those same surgical and botanical skills gave her a distinct advantage if she chose to wield them in a darker way. At last, the riders turned and vanished into the desert haze. Harriet exhaled slowly. She glanced back through the open door to see Jonah waiting at the threshold, brow creased with concern. "They're scouting the land again," she informed him quietly. "We need to be ready." Jonah nodded, worry plain in his eyes, but Harriet had already begun making mental notes, balancing what she'd prepared in secret with the immediate threat. She had reason to believe that if the raiders came for her ranch in force, she might meet them on her own terms, well armed, not with rifles alone, but with the botanical arsenal she'd been perfecting for months. Early the next morning, Harriet woke before dawn. She dressed in her unremarkable widow's garb, pinned up her hair, and stepped quietly outside. The heat was already building the desert, stirring with the faint scuttling of lizards across sandy soil. She lifted the wooden cover on the well, letting her eyes adjust to the dim light within. Everything she'd done was subtle, each step taken carefully so that no one could trace it back to her. The vials of tinctures and extracts stashed in her trunk represented decades of hard-won knowledge gleaned first as a traveling nurse, then as a surgeon's assistant in the war. She had spent recent weeks introducing minuscule quantities of certain compounds into a creek that flowed near the Iron Strike Raiders' hideout. Most of these compounds were slow-acting enough to cause progressive weakness or severe dehydration, but carefully calibrated so no one would realize the root cause until it was too late. She had reasoned from her vantage, as both a botanist and a mother desperate to protect her son, that if the raiders grew weak gradually, they'd be far easier to handle when the decisive moment arrived. The desert was already short on fresh water. Harriet knew exactly which veins of water they drew from to sustain their encampment hidden in Canyon del Hierro. She hadn't dosed the supply enough to kill them outright. She wanted them disoriented, sickly, unsure of themselves but still able to ride into the final trap. And Harriet had set that trap with the methodical patience she had once used in triage tents, where every second could mean life or death, but every rash decision risked losing the patient. Now, though the patient was a gang of outlaws whose cruelty had touched dozens of homesteads, including her own, after checking the well, Harriet walked the perimeter of the ranch. Chickens clucked inside their coop, and the slender desert grasses rustled near the fence line. The dryness of the air reminded her how precious water was. Jonah appeared behind her, half-dressed in his boots and suspenders, gazing at the same horizon. He asked if she thought they should invest in a better fence or post watchman. Harriet gave him a small, tight smile. Such gestures would never suffice to stop men like Barrett. Low words and fences could be taken down as easily as snapping a twig. Something more definitive was needed. "I'll be heading to Willow Bend proper today," Harriet said, already laying out the day's tasks. "We're short on supplies. Stay here. Keep an eye out for more riders." Jonah hesitated, wanting to accompany her. He rarely liked letting her go alone, especially with the threat of the raiders looming. But Harriet insisted she could manage just fine. The less he involved himself, the safer he'd be. Jonah, respectful if reluctant, complied. Once he might have pressed her harder, but of late he noticed a change in her. Despite the deep sadness after Caleb's death, Harriet's gaze had turned resolute, as if she had an invisible plan no one else could see. Departing for town, Harriet took the old wagon, its wheels squeaking in protest. As she drove, she recalled whispers she'd caught in Willowben. The Iron Strike Raiders had been extorting local businesses, pushing them to pay security fees, promising dire consequences if they refused. They torched barns, ambushed stagecoaches, and nobody dared speak out. The local sheriff was outmatched physically and financially. Harriet had recognized the pattern from her days in field hospitals, where roving marauders from both sides had sometimes collaborated to loot supplies, ignoring the war's official allegiances. In that same manner, Lowe's men had grown bold, wealthy, and dangerously organized. She also knew Lowe had a reputation for cruelty. Caleb's murder, rumored to have come from an Iron Strike bullet, confirmed the gang's lethal approach to negotiating land deals. The sun was well above the horizon by the time Harriet rumbled into Willowben's main street. A ragged hush hung over the place. Every building bore scars of the raiders' intimidation, smashed windows, hastily boarded up bullet holes, peppering facades, signs of one or two suspicious fires. Passing by the blacksmith shop, Harriet recalled how that building's owner, Daniel Royce, had once tried to stand up to the raiders and ended up half crippled. She forced her jaw to unclench, determined not to let her emotions sabotage her carefully laid strategy. At Henderson's General Supplies, a squat wooden brick store that served as the town's lifeline, Harriet noticed 4 horses tied out front, all branded with the distinctive iron strike symbol, a horseshoe flanked by crossing pickaxes. Steeling herself, Harriet grabbed her basket and walked through the entrance, prepared to feign the meekness of a woman with no fight left. Deep down, though, her pulse thrummed with the readiness of someone who had spent years learning how and when to deploy deadly knowledge. Inside the store, Harriet found Helena Henderson, cornered behind the counter by 2 of Lowe's riders. Helena, a slight yet resilient woman in her 30s, was trying to defend herself against demands for extra fees. On the floor lay scattered cans, spools of thread, sacks of flour, evidently knocked off shelves in an act of intimidation. One raider, a barrel-chested brute named Brannigan, whom Harriet recognized from rumors, brandished a revolver as he barked at Helena to pay up, or else another raider, younger and twitchy, occasionally snickered as if enjoying the cruelty. Quietly stepping forward, Harriet kept her basket clutched in front of her like a shield. One of the men shifted, noticing her. "We're busy," he snapped as stores closed, but Harriet, carefully maintaining the demeanor of a timid widow, asked, "I only need a few basics. Salt coffee, some rope." "It won't take long." Brannigan turned, recognition glinting in his eyes. "You're that Morrow woman, aren't you?" "The one with the well," he spat near her feet. "Heard you were being difficult about selling." "Not smart." Harriet swallowed, allowing her gaze to drop, though her mind raced. "I can't sell," she said softly, putting a slight tremor into her voice. "My husband left it to me. It's all we have." She took a step toward the counter. "We just want no trouble." Helena locked eyes with Harriet, silently begging for help. Harriet gave the faintest nod in return. In her pocket was a tiny pouch of powder, one capable of producing violent retching if added to food or water. But Harriet was no fool. Unleashing it here and now would be too obvious. Instead, she needed a more subtle approach. Brannigan sneered. "No trouble." "That's not how this works, Morrow. If you don't want trouble, you pay for the raiders' protection. You want to be safe from any accidents. That's going to cost you." He advanced forcibly, shoving Harriet's basket aside. The smaller raider gave a harsh laugh. Harriet nearly flinched, but not from fear, from the close-up whiff of body odor and bad breath that told her these men were too complacent. They'd grown used to their power, rarely challenged. That arrogance would be their downfall. "And if I don't pay?" Harriet dared to ask. She glanced at Helena as though seeking reassurance. But in truth, she was gauging the younger raider's stance and the possible angles to slip behind the counter. She had a small jar of ointment in her apron. A slight application to Brannigan's skin might incapacitate him for hours, but timing was everything. "If you don't pay," the younger man said with a grin, "we'll trash this store worse than we already have. Then we'll see if that well of yours is still standing by nightfall." Harriet pretended to tremble, lowering her gaze. "Understood." Then she reached into her apron pocket for the money she'd brought to buy supplies. She fished out a single coin and slid it across the counter. "I don't have much, but maybe it'll be enough. For now." The men scowled at the meager offering. Brannigan snatched the coin, pocketed it, and spat again. Then, as if to prove a point, he grabbed a bag of sugar from a nearby shelf and slammed it onto the ground. White crystals scattered everywhere. "Clean that up," he ordered Helena, who stood shaking behind the counter. Harriet bent to assist, carefully using her shawl to gather the spilled sugar. All the while, her mind turned over possibilities. She considered slipping the powder from her pouch into the men's canteens or their horse trough. But the sudden onset of sickness might raise suspicion too early. Harriet needed the raiders to blame their woes on something else. Bad water, the dessert, the heat right until the moment she was ready to strike the final blow. The men, apparently satisfied with their intimidation routine, left with a threat about returning in a week. Harriet helped Helena upright. "We'll manage, Helena," whispered, voice unsteady. Somehow, Harriet gave her a meaningful look. "Have faith, Helena. This won't go on much longer." Helena frowned, uncertain. She knew Harriet had some deeper plan, but not its details. None of them did except Harriet herself, and to a degree Dr. Pennington Willowben's aging physician, who had once worked alongside Harriet in a war hospital. Together, they understood how to handle threats that no official law could quell. The day wore on, and Harriet stepped outside into the sweltering sun, heading next to Dr. Pennington's modest office. A man well into his 70s, Pennington was the territory's only long-practicing physician. His arrival in Willowben predated even Harriet's first marriage. During the Civil War, Harriet had served under him as a nurse. She had learned from him how to treat bullet wounds, amputations, and infections with minimal tools. But she'd also learned during the latter part of the war which plants could kill a man from the inside out, leaving little trace until it was too late. Pennington greeted her quietly as she entered. His lined face betrayed concern. "You've seen them again, haven't you?" he asked, not bothering with pleasantries. Harriet nodded. "They'll keep pressing as long as they believe we can be frightened into selling." Pennington motioned for her to sit. Through a narrow window, Harriet saw the street and a few local folk passing by with their heads down, anxious to avoid trouble. Rumor is, Pennington said, Lowe's men have begun suffering from an unexplained ailment. Stomach cramps, fever, inability to hold down water. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you? Harriet maintained a careful expression. I may have heard something to that effect. She glanced at him. You know I wouldn't start anything. I couldn't finish. Pennington sighed. I want to be certain. If you push them too hard too fast, they'll retaliate in ways we can't contain. Harriet explained that her approach was measured. She'd begun with the creek near Canyon del Hierro, adding tiny amounts of a toxin derived from desert plants that specifically attacked the digestive system over weeks. It wasn't meant to kill, only to weaken. She explained that each new batch was introduced slowly, the dosage calibrated so that men who drank it regularly would experience debilitating fatigue and dehydration after a few weeks. By the time they realize something's wrong, Harriet said it'll be too late for them to trace it back to me. They'll assume it's a natural blight in the water. Pennington folded his hands on his desk. And if they kidnap your son, Harriet, if they think harming Jonah will force you to sign over the deed? Harriet's jaw tightened. I've taken steps to hide Jonah if the threat becomes imminent, but I'm also aware these men may not wait for negotiations. They know the well is precious. She paused, remembering how she'd once seen wounded soldiers used as bargaining chips in a war zone. I won't let Jonah become a casualty. Pennington studied her for a moment, sympathy and caution mingling in his eyes. You've changed since we last worked together in that triage ward. You were always strong-willed, but now you seem relentless. Harriet allowed a small, bitter smile. I was forced to watch Caleb die at the hands of these men, and I've spent years seeing that kind of cruelty go unpunished that changes a person. She stood adjusting her shawl. I only need you to be ready. If my plan unfolds as I expect, the raiders will soon be in no condition to mount a strong fight, but some might be spared. And if they are, we'll need your medical help, if only to keep them alive to face justice. Pennington nodded, though Harriet could see his unease. Medicine, after all, was supposed to heal. Yet here they were discussing how Harriet's medical knowledge could also be a weapon. On her return journey to the ranch, Harriet thought about how in the war she'd been known by many as a savior. Her skill with improvised remedies, her steady hand in surgery had earned respect from Union and Confederate soldiers alike, though the latter seldom realized she was on the opposing side. But Harriet also recalled the time she'd used her knowledge to end a spy's life by lacing his food with a slow-working poison. She remembered the moral weight of that choice. War had twisted all sense of normalcy. Now in peacetime, she felt that same moral burden pressing down as she prepared to systematically cripple the Iron Strike raiders. She had rationalized it as justice, not vengeance. Yet deep in her heart, she wondered where justice ended and vengeance began. Night fell by the time Harriet arrived home. Jonah greeted her at the door, eyes flicking to the supplies she carried. Everything all right in town, he asked, though he must have known the answer. Harriet gave a brief nod. Trouble as usual, but no open violence. Yet I had a talk with Dr. Pennington. He knows about the men who've been getting sick. Jonah's face paled. He'd guessed at his mother's involvement in the recent illnesses, but had never heard her confirm it. And he's covering for us. Harriet sighed. He's not thrilled, but he's loyal enough not to betray me. Jonah set about making a simple meal of beans and cornbread. Sitting across from him, Harriet watched the lantern light dance across his features, so reminiscent of his father's. She told him softly, I know you'd prefer we settle this through lawful means, but men like Barrett Lowe don't respect law, only power. If we wait for the sheriff, we'll lose everything. Jonah nodded, his mouth set in a grim line. He wanted to trust Harriet's plan, but fear lingered in his eyes. Fear for her safety and for his own. Harriet felt a pang of guilt. She had protected him from the ugliest realities of war when he was a child. Now those realities were at their doorstep. Their conversation was interrupted by a faint noise. Outside, the unmistakable rumble of multiple horses. Harriet immediately gestured for Jonah to douse the lantern. Together they peered through a gap in the shutter. 5 riders trotted up the trail, led by a tall figure Harriet recognized from descriptions, Barrett Lowe himself. A slender man, but with a posture of unshakable confidence. Lowe was rumored to be in his early 50s. Ex-Confederate, cunning enough to orchestrate a criminal enterprise that spanned territories. Harriet's heart thudded. This could be the confrontation she dreaded and prepared for. Lowe dismounted, scanning the darkened ranch. His men fanned out, flanking him. Harriet whispered to Jonah, Stay put. If something happens to me, ride to Fort Darrow. Find Captain Harcourt. Use the phrase I taught you. He'll know what to do. Jonah's lips parted in protest, but Harriet placed a hand on his arm. Don't argue, promise me. Reluctantly, Jonah nodded. Harriet then stepped outside, determined to meet this threat on her own terms. The moonless sky offered scant illumination as Harriet faced Barrett Lowe on the dirt path leading to her home. She could smell the tang of sweat and leather, feel the tension pouring off his men as they kept their hands near their guns. One carried a lantern that threw flickering shadows across Lowe's sharp features. He tipped his hat in a mock greeting. Mrs. Morrow, I presume we've been looking forward to speaking with you. Seems you've been making things difficult for my men. Harriet kept her expression subdued. I'm a simple ranch widow. I fail to see how anything I do could inconvenience you. Mr. Lowe let out a dry chuckle, stepping closer. I admire the humble act, but let's not play games. You filed water rights with the county clerk rights that obstruct my plans for this region. Then coincidentally, my men begin getting ill. Locals say you used to be involved in medicine back east, that you know all sorts of cures and poisons. It's quite a story. Behind Lowe, his men shifted restlessly. Harriet noted how 2 of them coughed intermittently, likely the earlier stages of her slow toxin. A little bit of dryness in the throat, easily dismissed as the dusty climate. If you're accusing me of something, Harriet said, letting her voice carry a hint of tremor, I'd like to hear it plainly. Lowe smiled. That's the thing about accusations, you need evidence. What I have, Mrs. Morrow, is an offer. Sell me your land, your well, and I'll pay you enough to go start a new life somewhere else. Refuse and I'll take what's mine anyway. Harriet's gaze flicked from Lowe to the men around him. My husband built this ranch with his bare hands. Our well is the only fresh source for miles. I can't just give it up. Lowe shrugged. Well, if you won't sell, consider a partnership. I'll handle the business side. You remain caretaker. We share the profits. Of course, you'll need to sign over the legal ownership so I can manage things properly. A fair arrangement. Don't you think Harriet recognized the trap? Once she signed, he'd discard her. She stood her ground. I'm not interested. The night air hung heavy with potential violence. Lowe gave a subtle nod and 2 of his men advanced, drawing Harriet away from the porch. Inside, Jonah peeked through a gap rifle at the ready, but Harriet had already signaled him to stay hidden. Lowe lowered his voice tone, menacing. They say you're the one behind my men's mysterious sickness, dosing the creek. I'd prefer to spare your life if we can come to terms. But push me and I'll burn this ranch to the ground. A wave of anger and old grief surged in Harriet. She recalled how Caleb's blood had stained her hands, how she'd wept powerless as the raiders rode off that fateful winter day. But Harriet forced herself to remain outwardly calm. This was still part of the dance. If you truly believe I poisoned your men, she said, I doubt you'd leave me alive, so maybe you don't believe it fully. Lowe paused, evidently weighing her words. You're right, I have my doubts. Poison is a coward's tool, but others are convinced you're capable. Let's say I'd like to see just how desperate you are. You have until tomorrow night to make your final decision. That's when we'll be back." With that, he and his men climbed onto their horses. Lowe glanced over his shoulder. "If you're not ready to sign, maybe we'll find another way to convince you, starting with that bright, ambitious son of yours." Harriet watched until the raiders disappeared into the darkness, their hooves stirring plumes of dust that glowed faintly in the lantern's light. Only then did she allow herself to release the breath she'd been holding. Jonah slid outside, rifle gripped in unsteady hands. "We can't stay here," he said, voice taut. "We should ride out tonight. Find somewhere safe, at least until they're gone." Harriet shook her head, though she understood his fear. "Running won't solve anything. They just track us down or take the ranch in our absence or worse." She set a hand gently on Jonah's shoulder, urging him to lower his rifle. "I won't let them do to you what they did to your father." Jonah blinked, fury and horror colliding in his expression. "But if you stand up to them alone, it's suicide." Harriet's gaze drifted to the barn where she stored her carefully hidden arsenal. Not just firearms, but potent mixtures. "Trust me, I won't be alone," she murmured. "They already have an enemy in their bloodstream. They just don't know it yet." The next morning, Harriet reinforced the perimeter of their property. Not by adding fences, she hammered small wooden stakes along a path near the well, tying strips of cloth dipped in a pungent solution that might repel the raiders' horses if they came too close. She also stocked the barn with supplies for Jonah in case he needed to hide there. A system of ropes and pulleys installed under the loft could create confusion or block the barn doors. Harriet was aware that such measures were only partial solutions. Her true advantage lay in having weakened the raiders from within. If she could keep them suspecting nothing until they reached peak vulnerability, the fight would tip in her favor. That afternoon, Harriet saddled her horse and prepared to ride to Canyon del Hierro. She had a small pouch of dried leaves and roots that would accelerate the poison's effects if introduced to the water supply. Jonah tried to dissuade her. "It's too close to their camp," he warned. "If they catch you," Harriet's eyes flashed, "then they'll confirm what they already suspect. Better I risk a quick infiltration now than face a full-strength ambush tomorrow." Setting off under the blazing sun, Harriet took a winding route through side gullies and sandy washes, mindful of any watchers. She'd scouted the canyon thrice before, always at a distance. Now she rode closer, dismounting at a cluster of boulders about a mile from the raiders' main hideout. She crept through narrow passes, each footstep stirring dust that tickled her nose. She checked the direction of the wind, ensuring it carried her scent away from any guard dogs. Twice she spotted watchmen perched on ridges, rifles resting across their knees. Both looked lethargic and tense, occasionally sipping from canteens. Harriet felt a grim satisfaction, knowing how those canteens were steadily harming them. At length she reached a narrow tributary of the creek that supplied the bulk of the raiders' water. A short climb brought her to a vantage point overlooking it. The water was clear but shallow, trickling over rocks. Harriet carefully removed the pouch of powdered leaves and dissolved them into a small glass bottle. Then, as silently as she could, she poured the mixture into the stream. Over the next day or two, any men who drank from it would develop sharper fevers, more severe digestive issues, and a dangerous lack of coordination. They'd be hobbled just when Lowe intended to strike Harriet's ranch. Every fiber in her body hummed with the awareness of risk. If the raiders discovered her presence, she might not escape. And if they realized she was the source of their sickness, they'd likely kill Jonah out of spite. Yet Harriet pressed on. She'd once sworn an oath in war to use her knowledge for healing, but circumstances and the memory of her murdered husband had driven her to a darker application of that same knowledge. Under the relentless sun, Harriet retreated from the canyon, leading her horse along rocky paths. She felt each inhale burn her lungs, reminding her of how harsh and unforgiving this land was. To Harriet, it symbolized the precarious balance she walked, using poison to protect innocent lives while risking moral condemnation. A memory flitted through her mind, a younger Harriet crouched by a Union soldier, administering an opium tincture to ease his passing. She'd whispered words of comfort back then, determined to save him if at all possible. But now her skills were reversed, channeled into destruction. She wondered if the line between hero and villain was thinner than anyone dared admit. By the time she emerged onto open desert, her canteen was nearly dry, her throat scratchy. In the distance, she saw a swirl of dust that might indicate riders, ducking behind a rocky outcropping. She waited, letting her heart steady. The swirl dissipated without approaching. Relieved, Harriet mounted and urged her horse homeward. She needed to finalize the ranch's defenses. Tomorrow evening was the raiders' deadline, and she suspected Barrett Lowe would show up in force intimidation, no longer a game, but an ultimatum. When she arrived back at the ranch, Jonah rushed out to meet her. "Someone came by while you were gone," he said, eyes shining with anxiety. He rode fast, said his name was Matthias Bly, the same Bly rumored to be an Iron Strike lieutenant. He demanded to know where you were. Harriet stiffened. "Did he threaten you?" Jonah nodded. "He said, if you don't sign over the deed, they'll take me as leverage. He left a drawing of a coffin with my initials. It's pinned on the door." Harriet's chest tightened. She found the crude sketch, a child's scrawl of a coffin, with JM scrawled in black ink tacked to the front door. The message was clear. Harriet calmly tore the paper down. Anger simmered. She'd lost Caleb. She refused to lose Jonah. The plan she'd set in motion had to work soon. They'd be weak or unprepared. But Harriet also recognized that with the raiders' desperation would come recklessness. A cornered animal fights hardest. That night, mother and son shared a meager supper in near silence. Harriet seldom prayed, but she found herself quietly wishing for some measure of justice that didn't involve further bloodshed. She turned in early, though she slept fitfully. In her dreams, she revisited those war-torn medical tents. Her hands dyed red, her soul heavy with unsaid confessions. In her dream, men in raider bandanas lay moaning, begging for help. She awoke in a cold sweat, unsure whether she was more disturbed by the dream's pity or by the readiness in her waking mind to let them die. Morning light revealed a hazy sky, a portent of high heat. Jonah quietly prepared the horses while Harriet arranged vials and supplies in the barn's hidden alcove. She tied them in labeled satchels, sedatives, irritants, lethal toxins, each meticulously tested. If there was a confrontation, Harriet wanted to control the terms. She could incapacitate or she could kill. Each outcome lay in her hands. The memory of her gentle role in the war, the countless times she'd saved children and soldiers with these same hands pressed against her heart. But there was no turning back. Not now. The tension in the air felt like charged static. As twilight neared, Harriet arrayed her plan methodically. Jonah would remain inside with a rifle and a small stash of Harriet's specialized bullets, tipped with a mild toxin that could cause heavy sedation if they only grazed a target. If lethal force proved necessary, Harriet had her standard ammunition at hand. She set lanterns around the ranch's perimeter to create illusions of movement and to help her keep track of shadows. Anyone creeping around would have to dodge those pools of light, making them easier targets from within. Harriet's heart thrummed with a mixture of dread and determination. She recalled the final words of a dying Confederate major she'd tended. "I fought for what I believed in. I die for it too." Harriet had believed in preserving lives during that chaotic war, but now she found herself fighting for something else: her home, her son, and the memory of the family she lost. The line from caretaker to combatant had become blurred indeed. Shortly after sunset, the rumble of approaching horses echoed across the desert. Through her window's vantage point, Harriet saw at least a dozen riders. They fanned out, forming a half circle around the front yard. In the center, Barrett Lowe sat tall on his stallion, flanked by Bly and Brannigan. Harriet could almost sense their agitation. Some coughed, some looked pale in the lantern's glow. The poison was in them, perhaps weakening them, enough to tilt the balance in her favor. Lowe called out, "Mrs. Morrow, we've come for your answer." Harriet stepped onto the porch, arms folded. "And if my answer is still no." Lowe's lips curled in a mocking grin. "I was hoping we could talk more privately, but if you're refusing, that means we use other methods to secure your cooperation." He gave a slight nod, and Bly dismounted, heading toward Harriet with menacing swagger. From behind Harriet, Jonah's voice rang out. "Stay back!" He aimed his rifle at Bly. Harriet, quietly proud of her son's courage, motioned for him to hold his fire. Bly gave a harsh laugh, but Harriet noticed the sweat on his brow, the dryness of his lips. "So that's how it's going to be." Bly spat. "You really want a shootout? There's more of us than you can handle." Before Harriet could respond, Brannigan, stationed at the outskirts, let out a muffled curse. He doubled over, retching violently. Another raider disturbed by this sudden sickness looked from Harriet to the barn. Harriet sees the moment you might find you're not as strong as you think, she said evenly. Been feeling poorly lately, stomach pains. Lowe's eyes flickered with anger and a trace of fear. The rumors of poisoning had haunted him more than he'd let on. If it's you, he snarled, I'll tear your throat out with my bare hands. Harriet took a single step forward off the porch. The desert wind carried the scent of horses and tension. I did what I had to, she said, letting the confession ring clear. You want our water so desperately, but you never considered that I might do more than sign papers. Now you're going to learn exactly how determined a mother can be. The standoff escalated with dizzying speed. Bly cocked his revolver. Jonah aimed from the window, Harriet's presence in his sights to avoid friendly fire. Lowe drew a sidearm, his expression taut. You're outnumbered, he growled. We'll bury you under your own well. Harriet's lips parted in a grim smile. I don't need to outnumber you. I only need to outlast you. At that signal, Jonah fired a single shot at Bly's feet. It kicked up dust, forcing Bly to stumble back. Harriet used the distraction to hurl a small glass vial onto the ground near two other raiders. A pungent cloud billowed up an irritant that stung eyes and throats. The men coughed, stumbling blindly while Harriet darted behind a water trough for cover. Lowe and several others opened fire bullets, whizzing overhead, splintering porch railings. Jonah ducked behind the window, returning fire with careful aim. Harriet peeked around the trough. Heart pounding, her entire plan hinged on the raiders' compromised health. She could see Brannigan doubled over in renewed retching, Bly staggering with watery eyes. A couple of the men were still strong enough to keep shooting, but the punishing desert climate combined with Harriet's toxins was draining them fast. Keeping her head low, Harriet reached into her belt for another small sphere, this one containing a mild tear gas-like concoction that she had refined using certain desert plants. She lobbed it into the midst of three disoriented raiders. Their yells filled the air as they clutched their burning faces. Amid the chaos, Harriet risked a glance toward Lowe. He had dismounted and crouched behind a barrel, his jaw clenched. She suspected the poison in his bloodstream made him dizzy, but adrenaline spurred him on. He bellowed orders, trying to rally his men. Push forward, take them alive. Harriet realized that the threat of Jonah being taken as a hostage was painfully real. She signaled Jonah to keep low, and if necessary, retreat to the barn's hidden chamber. A bullet ricocheted off the trough, sending a shard of wood into Harriet's arm. She winced but kept her composure. This was nothing compared to battlefield triage. She steadied her breath, thinking back to those war hospital nights holding a soldier's hand, hearing his final words, then moving on to the next focus. She aimed her revolver at a raider who was creeping along the side of the house. The shot grazed his shoulder, and he collapsed either from pain or from the toxins in his system. Harriet's knowledge of anatomy gave her an edge. She could target non-fatal spots that still incapacitated. Near the corral, Bly summoned two men who weren't visibly affected by the sickness, yet they rallied, flanking Harriet from the right. Seeing them advance, Jonah fired, striking one. Bly himself ducked behind a wooden fence. Harriet took advantage of a lull in the shooting to rush from her cover to a hitching post closer to the barn. Her breathing ragged, she noticed the iron tang of blood in her mouth. She must have bitten her lip at some point. Overhead, the stars had begun to glow in a moonless sky, like silent witnesses to the unfolding violence. The moment Harriet crouched down behind the hitching post, she heard Jonah shout, "Ma, watch out." She spun to see Bly lunging at her with a knife. A surge of terror and adrenaline shot through her. She managed to fire once at Bly, but he twisted aside, the bullet whizzing past. Then she felt a sharp slice along her forearm as he raked the blade toward her. Gasping, Harriet dropped her revolver. For an instant, Bly's triumph flashed in his eyes, yet Harriet was not defenseless. Clamping a hand around Bly's wrist, she leveraged a technique she'd learned while restraining delirious patients in field hospitals, using his momentum against him, rotating his arm until the knife clattered free. She rammed a knee into his gut, forcing him backward. He staggered, retching again, the earlier toxins surging under stress. Harriet dove for her fallen revolver, scooping it up as he tried to raise a small backup pistol. She squeezed the trigger. The bullet caught Bly in the thigh, and he toppled with a howl. Then a thunderous voice split the chaos. Enough, drop your weapons or die. Harriet looked up, heart-hammering, to see a new group of riders, familiar cavalry uniforms glinting in the lantern light. At the lead was Captain Thomas Harcourt, an imposing figure. Harriet recalled from old war connections Jonah must have signaled, or someone had alerted the fort. For a heartbeat, Harriet felt profound relief, but she also knew the fight was not yet over. Barrett Lowe still stood among his men, wounded pride fueling his next move. A sense of surreal calm settled over the ranch as Captain Harcourt's cavalrymen dismounted, forming a disciplined semicircle with rifles at the ready. The Iron Strike raiders, many of them coughing or otherwise debilitated, hesitated. In the flickering lantern light, Harriet wiped the blood from her arm, her thoughts racing. She knew Harcourt by reputation, strict, honorable, and unlikely to be swayed by bribes. But whether he was truly an ally or just another authority figure who'd try to claim credit for an ongoing conflict, she couldn't be sure. At this point, Harriet's only constant was her vow to protect Jonah and avenge her husband. Harcourt strode forward, scanning the smoky haze left by Harriet's irritant bombs. He barked an order for the raiders to stand down. "Drop your arms or my men will open fire," he warned. Several raiders, seeing their advantage vanish, complied, letting guns thud to the dusty ground. Harriet's gaze locked with Barrett Lowe's. He stood near a broken water barrel chest, heaving one hand pressed to his side. Even in the gloom, Harriet noticed the dampness staining his shirt. It might have been sweat or something worse. A bullet graze, perhaps. He wore an expression that mixed fury and calculating defiance. Jonah emerged, stepping cautiously from the ranch house. He exchanged a look with Harriet that said, "I'm all right." Relief flooded her, but she dared not let it show too openly. She approached Harcourt, ignoring the stinging wound on her forearm. "Captain," she managed, inclining her head in polite greeting. He inclined his in return. "Mrs. Morrow, is it? We've received multiple reports of violent activity by these men. We came as soon as we heard Harriet suspected Jonah had found a way to contact Harcourt earlier, or that her longtime ally, Dr. Pennington, had pulled strings." Either way, Harriet was relieved to see official backup for once. Barrett Lowe wiped sweat from his brow, his gaze darting between Harriet and Harcourt. "We have a legitimate dispute here, Captain," he said, forcing a civil tone. "Mrs. Morrow and I have been negotiating property rights. Seems she resorted to violence." Harcourt gave him a flat look. "You call this negotiation? My scouts have also witnessed your men terrorizing townsfolk. You're under suspicion for racketeering, extortion, and multiple homicides. I'd advise you to keep quiet until you're formally questioned." Some of the cavalry began collecting the raiders' guns. Others tended to Harriet's booby traps, ensuring none posed a lingering hazard. Harriet wondered how many of her toxins lingered in the soil or on spattered surfaces, but that worry paled compared to the immediate tension. Lowe's men, half of them disabled by Harriet's cunning or by the slow-acting poisons, glowered in submission. Yet Harriet sensed a cunning in Lowe that didn't vanish simply because the cavalry had arrived. She glanced at Bly, crumpled on the ground, pressing his bleeding thigh. He was in no condition to protest. Brannigan lay retching near the porch. Harriet was certain at least one or two others had fled into the darkness, but for the moment the raiders' main threat was contained. Harcourt moved among the men, ordering his soldiers to secure them. Harriet leaned against a post, exhaustion creeping in her breath. Ragged, Jonah hurried over, gently lifting her injured arm. "Ma, that needs cleaning. Let's get you inside." Harriet shook her head. In a moment, she motioned to Harcourt, "Captain, we need to talk about what happens next. These men still have resources, connections in Willow Bend Sheriff's Office." Harcourt's brow furrowed. "We'll escort them to Fort Darrow. Hold them for a proper hearing. Even the crooked local authorities can't override a federal process. You and your son will be safe." Harriet noticed Lowe's faint smirk at those words. That was a bad sign. Was he banking on escape or some loophole in the system? Ma Jonah repeated. Harriet squeezed his hand. "All right, let's tend this wound." She let Jonah guide her inside. Through the open door, she glimpsed Harcourt's men hauling the raiders to their horses. Barrett Lowe cast one last venomous glance over his shoulder before vanishing from view. Harriet had a fleeting worry. If Lowe escaped or was released, the vengeance he'd wreak would be tenfold. She suppressed a shiver, reminding herself that she'd planned meticulously for every outcome. Perhaps she'd have to ensure Lowe never walked free. In war, sometimes you couldn't rely on a fair trial to secure justice. Dawn found Harriet in a haze of half-sleep, perched in a chair at her kitchen table. Her wounded arm was bandaged. Outside, Captain Harcourt's unit had made temporary camp on the far side of the property. Jonah slept fitfully in his bedroom every so often, waking from nightmares that Harriet knew all too well. The day's events had left them both exhausted, yet Harriet's mind wouldn't let her rest. She was haunted by the knowledge that the conflict wasn't truly over. The cavalry had seized a handful of the Iron Strike raiders, but Harriet had glimpsed some escaping into the desert. Barrett Lowe had sworn he'd return, or at least that Harriet would pay for her defiance, and Harriet believed him. When the sun finally rose, Harriet forced herself up to start breakfast. She found she had little appetite, but knew Jonah needed to keep his strength. She put coffee on the stove and heated some leftover beans. Over the gentle clatter of kitchen utensils, Harriet reviewed her mental ledger of toxins, the status of Canyon del Hierro's water supply, and the possibility that survivors might retaliate quickly. The cavalry's presence might deter them for a while, but Harriet had learned in war that a determined enemy wasn't easily kept at bay by a uniform alone. Soon Jonah appeared bleary-eyed. He offered a small, reassuring smile. "Captain Harcourt wants to debrief us," he said quietly. "He's waiting outside." Harriet handed Jonah a mug of coffee. "Finish that, then we'll go." As Jonah sipped, Harriet studied his face, a strong jawline that mirrored his father's eyes, that held the residual innocence of a youth who still wanted to fix things peacefully. She wondered if once all this ended, Jonah could resume his life's ambition, engineering solutions to make desert lands bloom. That was her deepest hope, better that he spent his future building, rather than learning more ways to destroy outside. They found Harcourt looking troubled as he stood by the corral fence. The morning light revealed more lines in his face than Harriet recalled from years past. He greeted them with a curt nod. "Mrs. Morrow, Jonah, we'll be moving out soon with our prisoners. There's just one snag." Harriet arched a brow. Snag? Harcourt exhaled, gesturing toward two cavalry scouts who'd just ridden in Scout's report. "The rest of Lowe's men are consolidating near Willowbend, probably half a dozen or more led by a lieutenant named Gideon Roth. They want to break Lowe and the others free. That means an ambush on the way to Fort Darrow is likely." Harriet's stomach clenched. "So if you try to transport Lowe through the canyons, you risk your entire unit." Harcourt nodded grimly. "We could wait for reinforcements, but that could take weeks. Meanwhile, Willowbend remains vulnerable. The raiders might lash out at the townsfolk." Harriet bit her lip. She recalled all too well how quickly the raiders destroyed property and lives when cornered. "Then the solution is obvious," she said. "You can't move them safely. You keep them here at least until you have enough men to ensure a secure route." Harcourt frowned. "Holding them here puts you in more danger. Lowe won't hesitate to launch an assault, and I haven't the resources for a prolonged siege," Jonah chimed in. "What if we do something to draw Gideon Roth out away from Willowbend? We could pretend the cavalry is leaving while the prisoners remain hidden somewhere else." Harcourt gave the young man an appraising look. "Intriguing but risky. Where would we hide them?" "The ranch." Harriet's gaze slid to the barn. "We have a storm cellar beneath the barn floor. It's strong hidden. And I have certain methods to ensure they remain too weak to cause trouble." Harcourt's face revealed curiosity, but also caution. "I've heard you're behind their mysterious illnesses. I'm not in the business of condoning poison." "Mrs. Morrow," Harriet raised her chin. "In war you use what you must. The alternative is losing everything. If we keep them sedated just enough that they can't overpower a guard, that might buy us time." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "I'll take responsibility for the moral implications. All I ask is that you keep Jonah safe and ensure these men eventually face real justice." Harcourt studied her tension in his posture. Finally, he gave a single nod. "All right, for the sake of Willowbend. I'll accept your plan, but do not kill them in cold blood. They'll stand trial at Fort Darrow or no deal." Harriet and Jonah spent the next few hours making the barn ready. In the back corner, concealed beneath piles of hay, was a trap door leading to an old root cellar. Caleb had dug it years ago for extra storage. Harriet had since reinforced it with wooden beams, turning it into a secret vault for her more delicate experiments. It was cramped, but Harriet figured it would suffice as a makeshift holding cell for Barrett Lowe and a few key raider leaders. Meanwhile, Harcourt arranged for the rest of his men to create a decoy operation pretending to transfer all the prisoners, but in truth only taking the lesser raiders and leaving behind the big threats. "It's like staging an elaborate trick," Jonah remarked, wiping sweat from his brow as he repositioned crates. Harriet nodded, feeling the sting of her bandaged arm. "Tricks save lives sometimes. If Gideon Roth sees the cavalry leaving, he might assume Lowe is with them, so he'll plan an ambush on the road. That'll give us time here to manage Lowe." Jonah grimaced. "And if he realizes we kept Lowe behind Harriet's mouth set in a line, then we'll have to defend this place again, hopefully with fewer enemies overall. Besides, we still have the advantage that I've poisoned their main water sources. Roth's men may be weaker than they know." By midday, the plan was in motion. Harcourt escorted most of the raiders, those Harriet deemed less essential for interrogation, off the ranch. Mounted on wagons and horses, they appeared to be a full escort complete with Barrett Lowe's empty shackles displayed prominently. Harriet remained behind, claiming she needed to recover from her injury. Once the cavalry was out of sight, Harriet and Jonah quietly hauled Lowe and two of his most loyal men from a hidden stall in the barn, transferring them into the root cellar. Lowe, wrists bound, glowered at Harriet, veins bulging in his neck. His shirt was stained with sweat, and Harriet guessed he was running a fever, likely the poison's next stage. "You think this ends well for you?" he rasped. "My men will carve your heart out for this." Harriet pressed a damp cloth to her forehead, feigning mild concern. "You're dehydrated, Mr. Lowe. Let me give you something that might help." She withdrew a small vial, meeting his defiant stare. "You can resist, but I promise you won't enjoy the outcome." One of Lowe's men, a lanky figure named Silas, tried to spit at Harriet. Jonah responded by tightening the ropes binding Silas's arms. "Let's not make this worse." Jonah warned, voice shaking slightly with adrenaline. Harriet appreciated Jonah's attempt at sounding authoritative, though she could tell it was taking every ounce of his composure. Lowe eyed Jonah, sneering. "Kid, you have no idea what you're doing." Without another word, Harriet poured a measured dose of her sedative-laced mixture into a tin cup. She offered it to Lowe drink. Lowe refused, so Harriet gave a look to Jonah, who pinned Lowe's arms behind him. Harriet calmly pinched Lowe's nose until he was forced to open his mouth. Then she tipped the liquid in, ensuring he swallowed enough. Lowe cursed and sputtered, but within a few minutes his protest grew sluggish. His eyes drooping, Silas and the other man, Carter, soon followed. Harriet felt a perverse echo of her wartime days administering laudanum to wounded men. But those were men who needed healing, not criminals who threatened her son. Once the prisoners were subdued, Harriet locked the cellar door. She checked for air ventilation and made sure they had minimal water so they wouldn't die of thirst. She wasn't aiming to kill them, not yet. Part of her wanted to see them hang in a proper trial, but if that failed, Harriet knew she had the final solution in her hidden vials. Morality, once so black and white when she was a nurse, had become an inescapable shade of gray. For the next couple of days, Harriet kept up the charade. When Gideon Roth's scouts prowled the outskirts, Harriet or Jonah would make a show of riding into town, returning with minor supplies, never letting on that 3 raiders lay drugged in their root cellar. Captain Harcourt, meanwhile, sent word that he'd successfully baited a small ambush on the road Gideon Roth had attacked, hoping to free Barrett Lowe, only to find no sign of him. Although the cavalry took some losses, they scattered the ambushers, capturing or killing several more. Roth himself escaped. All this meant Harriet had a shrinking but desperate group of raiders, possibly headed her way. Jonah, noticing Harriet's taut posture one morning as she fed the prisoners, asked Ma, "When does it end?" "We can't keep them down there forever," Harriet exhaled. "I'm waiting on confirmation from Harcourt. Once he returns with reinforcements, we'll transport Lowe and the others to Fort Darrow safely." Jonah rubbed his temples. "And if Gideon Roth shows up first, we could be overrun." Harriet gently placed a hand on Jonah's shoulder. "I have a fallback plan. The well behind our barn is still ours, and the canyon supply is compromised. If Roth tries an all-out assault, they'll be weakened again." She paused, eyes drifting to the horizon. "I never wanted this kind of war at our doorstep. But it's here. We can't run, so we make sure we survive." Mid-afternoon found Harriet in the barn checking the prisoners. Lowe stirred, glassy-eyed, struggling to focus on Harriet's face. She measured another dose of sedative. Do you know, Lowe muttered, how many men I've left broken from here to Louisiana? You think you'll win this, but there's always another wave. Harriet pressed the cup to his lips, ignoring his rant. She watched him drink, though she couldn't deny a pang of pity. If life had led her differently, would she be the one in chains forced to survive by predatory means? After locking the cellar, Harriet walked outside and nearly collided with Jonah, who had a panicked expression. Two riders approaching from the west, he blurted. Harriet's pulse kicked. She reached for her revolver. Raiders, Jonah shook his head uncertain. They climbed a small bluff near the ranch to watch. The riders wore dusty clothes but no clear iron strike insignia. As they drew near, Harriet recognized the elder of the two, a woman named Clara Hawthorne, known to be a traveling nurse of sorts, though Harriet suspected she might also be a messenger for Pennington or even Harcourt. Clara and her companion, a young man, dismounted carefully. Harriet signaled Jonah to stay alert as she came forward. Clara took off her broad hat, wiping sweat from her brow. Harriet Morrow, she called Dr. Pennington, sent us with news. Gideon Roth is rallying a final push into Willowbend. Could be any day now. The sheriff can't hold them off. Pennington says to warn you, Roth wants revenge for Barrett Lowe's capture. He's sure you're still hiding him. Harriet's jaw tightened. So it was out. How large is Roth's band? Clara shook her head, her expression grim. Big enough, maybe 9 or 10. But they're not slowed by illness like the others. They never drank from that poison creek. Harriet's eyes narrowed. That was the worst-case scenario facing raiders who weren't compromised by her toxins. Are the townsfolk evacuating? Clara nodded. Many are heading south or barricading themselves. They fear Roth will destroy Willowbend, just to make an example. Jonah, overhearing, looked stricken. We have to help Helena, Henderson, Dr. Pennington, so many others could be hurt. Harriet recalled the battered storefronts and the people who'd pinned their hopes on her. She exhaled, thinking of the Hippocratic oath she'd once held dear to do no harm to protect lives. That vow had become twisted by circumstances. But perhaps now she could wield her knowledge to defend, not just avenge. She turned to Clara. Thank you for the warning. Return to town, tell Pennington we'll come. I need to ensure these men, she gestured to the barn, don't escape or become a liability. Then we'll ride in to help. Clara gave a curt nod, remounted, and spurred off. Jonah stood there, anxious energy radiating from him. We have to find a way to keep Lowe contained while we assist Willowbend, he said. Harriet glanced at the barn. I'll handle it. Get some supplies ready. Enough to stay in town for a few days if needed. Jonah hesitated, as though sensing Harriet's next move might be morally complicated. Then he hurried into the house. Harriet approached the barn with grim resolve. She'd keep Lowe sedated for as long as it took. If Gideon Roth threatened Willowbend, Harriet had to make sure the raiders in her cellar posed no threat in her absence. Bolted the cellar door. The three men were awake, and Harriet noticed with dismay that one of them, Silas, was particularly alert. He must have refused to swallow his sedative. Carter, still dazed, was leaning against the stone wall. Lowe, though, looked pale and feverish, possibly from lingering poison. He shot Harriet a baleful glare. You think you've won. Roth is out there gathering men. He'll find you, burn your ranch, kill your brat. Harriet forced down her anger. She knelt by Lowe, retrieving a fresh vial from her bag. This will ease your discomfort, she said flatly, though all four of them knew that was a lie. Lowe coughed a laugh. You're no better than us, you know? You kill like it's nothing. Harriet paused mid-motion. I kill only to protect, you kill for power. She realized the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. She'd long since blurred that line between righteous defense and calculated homicide. As Harriet tried to administer the sedative, Lowe jerked his head aside. No, he hissed. Silas took advantage of Harriet's lowered guard, lunging forward. Harriet stumbled back, nearly dropping the vial. Jonah, who had slipped in behind her, swung the butt of a rifle at Silas's head, connecting with a dull crack. Silas collapsed, moaning. Harriet steadied herself, her heart hammering, and quickly forced the sedative down Lowe's throat, while Jonah tied Silas's hands behind his back with rope. Carter offered no resistance. He seemed too weary or drugged. This will keep you quiet till we return. Harriet murmured. Jonah's breath came fast. We're really leaving them here alone. Harriet nodded. We'll lock the cellar from outside, secure every exit. The place is sturdy enough that they can't break free easily. They won't starve or suffocate, not for days anyway. By that time, we'll have dealt with Gideon Roth. Jonah swallowed hard, nodding. He hated it, but he understood. Harriet carefully replaced the wooden trapdoor, then sealed it with iron hooks in a heavy crate. "That's the best we can do," she said. "Let's gather what we need for Willowben." A half-hour later, Harriet and Jonah rode out, leaving the ranch behind. Harriet's stomach twisted with fear at the thought of returning to find it burned or the cellar compromised. Yet duty urged her onward. Willowbend. Dr. Pennington, Helena, and countless families were threatened by Gideon Roth's final push. Harriet pressed her horse to a brisk pace. Jonah followed, dust rising in their wake. They reached Willowbend by late afternoon. The main street was unnervingly quiet. Some shops were boarded up. Others displayed bullet holes from recent skirmishes. Harriet tethered her horse near the general store. A group of townsfolk armed with makeshift weapons huddled in a vantage point across from the saloon. Dr. Pennington stood among them, wearing his worn coat and a determined expression. Upon seeing Harriet, his face flickered with relief. "You made it." Harriet dismounted, glancing around warily. "Any sign of Roth?" Pennington nodded toward the far side of town. "Riders have been spotted. We estimate they'll come at night, maybe in the early hours when fear is at its peak." Helena Henderson emerged from behind Pennington, clutching a rifle. "We've rigged some barricades," she told Harriet, voice trembling with both fear and resolve. "But we need a plan. People look to you as if you can drive them off like you did the rest of the raiders." Harriet's eyes flicked over the assembled townsfolk, older men, young boys, shopkeepers, even a few women who refused to evacuate. She realized they expected her to replicate her ranch strategy, but these raiders weren't already half-poisoned. Harriet's mind spun, recalling her knowledge of crowd control tactics from the war using smoke bombs, strategic illusions, and maybe a dash of the chemical irritants she developed. She inhaled deeply. "All right, here's what we do," she began, voice steady. "We'll use the town's layout to our advantage. The raiders will likely come in from the east. We can funnel them along the main street if we block side alleys. Then we hit them with confusion, smoke irritants. We won't try to kill them outright unless they force our hand. We just need to break their resolve." As dusk fell, Harriet and Jonah directed townsfolk to create rudimentary barricades using wagons, crates, and piles of debris. They rigged lanterns at strategic points to illuminate likely approach routes and cast misleading shadows elsewhere. Harriet handed out small glass spheres filled with a mix of chili powder, sulfur, and other compounds that, when ignited, would produce an acrid smoke. "Wait until they're close," she instructed. "Then toss these. It won't kill them, but it'll sting their eyes and throats." Several of the older men looked uneasy, uncertain about Harriet's unconventional methods. One murmured, "We've never fought with chemicals before." Harriet gave a grim smile. "Trust me, these men won't expect it. That's our advantage." She looked at Dr. Pennington. "Please have your surgery ready to treat both our wounded and the raiders who might surrender." "We're not butchers." Pennington nodded, a flicker of pride in his gaze. "I know you're not." In the lull before midnight, Harriet perched on a rooftop with Jonah scanning the edges of Willowben. A nearly full moon lit the dusty streets. Below them, quiet watchers gripped rifles, waiting behind barricades. Every so often, Harriet glimpsed movement, a shifting shadow at the perimeter of town. She suspected Gideon Roth was scouting, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Jonah's voice was barely audible over the faint wind. "Ma, do you remember any of the times you used healing on a grand scale? All the stories I heard from the war were about how you saved soldiers. Now I look around and see you orchestrating a defense with chemicals, booby traps." "It feels so different," Harriet exhaled slowly, reaching over to squeeze Jonah's hand. "It is different. I never expected to fight another war. But if I have to choose between letting these outlaws destroy innocent families or using what I know to protect them, then I choose to fight." She paused, looking down at Jonah's anxious expression. "If you find that you can't stomach what I do, don't blame yourself. War changes all the rules. You still have time to build rather than destroy." Jonah's gaze dropped. "Father would have fought to protect us too, I think. But not like this, right?" Harriet heard the unspoken question. "Are you sure you're doing the right thing?" She didn't have a clean answer. "Your father wasn't forced into these choices, but I have no regrets about defending you. I'd do it again." The clock struck midnight, each soft toll from the old mission's bell resonating through the hush. Harriet tensed. Sometimes enemies capitalized on the shift from day to night, counting on human fatigue. Sure enough, at around the sixth bell, movement rippled at the far end of Main Street. Figures emerged, mounted silhouettes in the moonlight. Harriet lifted her spyglass, heart pounding. She spotted at least 8 riders, maybe more, each armed. In their midst rode a tall, broad-shouldered man with a savage beard and a stern posture. That had to be Gideon Roth under the moon's cool glare. Gideon Roth and his men advanced slowly. The barricaded street forced them to funnel close. Harriet signaled to the watchers, "Hold your positions. Don't fire yet." She wanted them lured into the zone where her irritant bombs would be most effective. From her vantage, she could almost see Roth's narrowed eyes as he surveyed the silent buildings. He must sense a trap. Still, the raiders pressed forward, banking on superior firepower or raw aggression. Then Roth shouted, his voice carrying across the still air. "We know you're in there. Morrow, show yourself." Harriet pressed her lips together, refusing to answer. She studied the formations. The lead riders fanned out in an attempt to flank the barricades. Another cluster, presumably covering Roth, stuck to the center. Harriet spotted a man lugging what looked like a small keg strapped to his horse. Possibly explosives. That told her all she needed to know. They intended to blow their way through if cornered. A shot rang out. One of the anxious townsfolk must have fired prematurely. The bullet pinged harmlessly off a wagon, but it shattered the tension, sparking immediate chaos. Roth's riders fanned out, guns blazing at windows and rooftops. Harriet muttered a curse, then flicked her own ignition stick, lighting a rag stuffed into a small jar. She hurled it into the street below. A burst of thick smoke rose, swirling in the sudden wind of bullet trajectories. Jonah flung 2 more spheres of Harriet's irritant mix. Coughs and curses erupted from the raiders, caught in the expanding cloud. Shots crisscrossed the street, muzzle flashes, strobing the darkness. Harriet glimpsed Dr. Pennington ducking behind a doorway, ready to treat the wounded. Helena Henderson and 2 other townsfolk unleashed, covering fire from behind an overturned cart. Harriet fired at a rider who tried to scale a side alley, the bullet striking the man's leg. He tumbled off his horse. Another raider threw a torch onto a wooden walkway, igniting planks with bright flames. Smoke choked the air. Harriet tried not to think about how swiftly the entire block could catch fire. Through the haze, she heard Gideon Roth's furious bellow, "Fight through fine morrow." Harriet realized they might attempt to blow the barricade. She signaled Jonah to focus on the man carrying the keg. If that keg was dynamite, the devastation would be catastrophic. Jonah, eyes watering from drifting smoke, took careful aim. Harriet prayed silently for his shot to be true. The crack of the rifle tore through the mayhem. A spark flew off the keg as the bullet struck, causing an immediate flash of flame. Harriet ducked, expecting an explosion. But something must have been off. Instead of a massive detonation, the keg fizzled, perhaps only partially ignited. The raider cursed, trying to smother the tiny flame with his gloved hand. Harriet seized the chance. She snatched another irritant bomb and lobbed it closer to the keg bearer. More acrid smoke engulfed him. He retched, dropping his weapon. Roth, seeing the tide turning, wheeled his horse around, firing wildly into windows. Harriet kept behind a stone chimney on the roof, peering out to track him. His voice still resonated with a terrifying command. "Regroup, damn it! Push them back!" A couple of raiders tried to follow his order, stumbling through the swirling smoke. Harriet realized they were well trained, but the confusion stoked by her chemical concoctions turned their discipline into chaos. One raider, eyes streaming tears, blindly galloped his horse straight into a barricade, sending man and beast sprawling. Another, coughing, violently retreated down a side street. Harriet took no pleasure in their suffering. She pressed her advantage, reloading. Jonah laid down suppressive fire. Townsfolk emerged from behind wagons, picking off the disoriented raiders. All Harriet wanted was for them to surrender. A bullet grazed Harriet's shoulder, tearing a chunk from her blouse. She hissed in pain, returning fire at the muzzle flash. A grunt told her she'd hit her target. Gradually, the gunfire tapered, replaced by moans, coughs, and the crackling of small fires. Gideon Roth seemed nowhere in sight, though Harriet suspected he hadn't run far. She waved at Jonah, indicating they should descend and check the street. The 2 of them, along with a handful of townsfolk, crept through the debris and swirling smoke injured raiders lay scattered. A few had surrendered, coughing out pleas for water. Dr. Pennington and Helena rushed forward to offer triage. Harriet scanned the shadows for the big man with the savage beard. A shrill whistle pierced the night coming from an alley near the saloon. Harriet froze, motioning Jonah to cover her. She advanced carefully, revolver raised. There in the alley's dim light, Gideon Roth stood half hidden behind a stack of crates. He aimed a pistol at Harriet, while his other hand held something more horrifying. A teenage girl no older than 14, who Harriet recognized as Lucy Farnham, the blacksmith's daughter Roth, pressed his pistol to Lucy's head. "Drop it," he snarled at Harriet. Harriet's stomach twisted. Lucy's tear-streaked face clenched Harriet's heart. Harriet raised her free hand in a placating gesture. "All right, calm down." She slowly set her revolver on the ground. Jonah, seeing Harriet disarm, hovered at the mouth of the alley rifle, trembling. Harriet subtly signaled him to hold Roth. She said, voice trembling with adrenaline, "There's no need for a hostage surrender, and we'll see you get a fair trial." Roth let out a bitter laugh. "You talk as if you're not a killer yourself. Morrow, word says you poisoned half my men." Harriet swallowed, searching for an angle. "They were terrorizing families, stealing water. That's all I had left to stop them." Roth barked out another laugh. "You could have run, but you stood your ground, picking us off one by one." Lucy whimpered, and Harriet's gaze flicked to the terror in the girl's eyes. She recalled her own experiences in the war, seeing children used as shields. This had to end. Jonah stepped into view, but Harriet spoke quickly. "Jonah, don't. He'll shoot her." Roth's eyes darted between Jonah and Harriet. "Tell your boy to throw away the rifle," he growled, pressing the barrel harder against Lucy's temple. Harriet nodded at Jonah, who grimaced and set his rifle on the ground. Harriet thought frantically, scanning the alley for anything she could use: a broken plank, a stray shard of glass. The war had taught her to fight with whatever was available, but in these cramped quarters, Roth had the advantage. He was bigger, stronger, and possessed advantage of Lucy's life. Roth took a step forward, dragging Lucy along. Harriet realized he aimed to reach a horse or some exit behind the saloon. "You're going to let me walk out tomorrow," he said. "And you won't chase me. Otherwise, the girl dies." Harriet suppressed a tremor. She'd seen enough atrocities in the war to know he might just pull the trigger anyway. She had to distract him. "If you kill her," Harriet said, "your men will have died for nothing." Roth scoffed. "They already died for nothing. Barrett Lowe got himself caught by your freakish poison. This entire operation is a lost cause. I'm only saving myself now." In the corner of her vision, Harriet caught a flicker of motion. Jonah was stepping sideways, inching behind some barrels. Harriet tried to keep Roth's attention. "At least let Lucy go. You'll move faster alone." Roth squinted, thinking it over. "Nice try, but I'm not that stupid." "She's my ticket out," Harriet's pulse roared in her ears. She regretted not bringing a small pocket bomb or irritant for close range, but there was no time. She clenched her hands, trying to appear scared and beaten. Suddenly, Jonah lunged from the side, heaving a barrel toward Roth. Harriet sprang forward in the same instant. The barrel collided with Roth's shoulder, knocking him off balance. Lucy twisted away with a cry. Harriet threw her entire weight into Roth, grappling for his gun. He roared in fury, fists swinging. Harriet felt a blow rattle her ribs, but she clung on, driven by raw desperation. She jammed her elbow into his throat, forcing him to stagger. Jonah yanked Lucy away out of the line of fire. Roth lashed out again, his pistol whirling in a vicious arc. Harriet narrowly dodged. She saw Jonah pulling Lucy to safety. Good Harriet turned all her focus on disarming Roth. But his strength was formidable. He shoved Harriet against the wall, sending white pain lancing through her bandaged arm. She gasped, losing her grip on his wrist. He pointed the gun at her head. Harriet stared at the barrel, her mind going eerily calm. Then a shot echoed from behind Roth. He jerked forward, eyes wide, and Harriet felt the bullet pass so close that it grazed her shoulder. Roth let out a choked gasp, dropping his pistol. Behind him stood Dr. Pennington, hands shaking as he lowered a revolver. The shot had struck Roth in the back of his left shoulder. Non-lethal but disabling, Roth collapsed to his knees, moaning. Harriet stepped back, chest heaving, aware that she was inches from death. Pennington's face, pale, approached cautiously. Revolver still raised. "Harriet, are you?" Harriet nodded shakily, glancing at the blood seeping from Roth's wound. "He'll live if we treat him," she managed. Pennington blew out a breath, relief and shock mingling in his expression. "Let's get him to the surgery." The aftermath of the raid was a somber tableau. Streets smoldered from small fires. A few buildings bore new scars, but Willowbend still stood. Local men and women stepped out of hiding to help gather the wounded. Dr. Pennington and Harriet labored through the night, tending raiders and townsfolk alike. Harriet stitched bullet wounds, administered basic painkillers, and improvised splints. She felt a wave of déjà vu from her war days, blood moans frantic, searching for supplies. Yet this time Jonah aided her, handing instruments, fetching water, holding down patients who thrashed in delirium. Lucy Farnham's parents arrived, hugging her in a tearful reunion. Harriet managed a tired smile, glad the girl was safe. In a corner of the surgery, Gideon Roth lay restrained on a cot, bullet lodged near his shoulder blade. He was conscious, spitting venomous curses whenever Harriet approached. "You think this changes anything?" he snarled once. "Lowe's men never die off. Another figure will rise. Maybe not me, maybe not Lowe, but someone else. You can't poison the whole West." Harriet said nothing, just checked his wound. Part of her knew he might be right. The cycle of violence rarely ended. But for now, Willowbend could breathe. By dawn, Harriet had cleaned the last of the bandaged patients. She stepped outside the surgery, rubbing her aching neck, and found Jonah dozing on a bench. A streak of pinkish gold lit the eastern sky. Townsfolk gingerly emerged to assess damages. A hush fell as Harriet passed. Some called her name in hushed gratitude. Others watched warily, as though unsure if the rumors about her poison-making were true. She recognized their mixture of relief and apprehension. In less than a year, she'd gone from a mere widow to a figure known for striking terror into a powerful gang. Mayor Eckhart, a portly man who'd taken charge post-raid, approached Harriet. "Miss Morrow, we owe you a great debt. I've never seen these outlaws so thoroughly routed." He cleared his throat awkwardly. "But some folks are concerned about your methods. They say you use poison chemical bombs. That's not how civilized people fight." Harriet met his gaze. "Civilized people shouldn't have to fight at all. But here we are. If you'd had a better option, I'd have listened." The mayor swallowed, then extended his hand. "I don't judge you harshly, ma'am. In fact, the council wants to present you a token of appreciation. There's talk of building a new clinic, naming it after you." Harriet's cheeks flushed. "I'm not sure that's necessary. I only did what was needed." In the distance, Harriet saw Dr. Pennington tending to a fallen raider with a broken leg. She considered how often she'd been called the angel of mercy in the war, how she'd saved men who wore the uniform of her enemy. Now she was being lauded for poisoning a gang into submission. The contradiction churned in her gut. But as Jonah and Lucy Farnham approached, both safe and alive, Harriet knew she wouldn't have done anything differently. She might not be proud of the suffering she inflicted, but at least it prevented a greater evil. Jonah rubbed his bloodshot eyes. "Ma, I think we need to return to the ranch soon. Check on—" His voice trailed off. Not wanting to speak Barrett Lowe's name in front of the mayor, Harriet nodded, mindful that their captivity arrangement could unravel at any moment. "Yes, we'll leave once Dr. Pennington is stable with these patients." Behind them, a pair of newly arrived cavalry officers conferred with the mayor. Harriet noted they wore the insignia of Fort Darrow. Maybe Harcourt had sent them ahead. The cavalry presence, combined with Harriet's final blow against Roth, meant Willowbend might finally see peace. Harriet closed her eyes briefly. If only her ranch was secure. If only Barrett Lowe remained safely locked away until the law could do its job. Yet Harriet's instincts whispered that her final reckoning with Lowe was not far off, and that the desert had a way of resurrecting its devils, if not put to rest permanently. Late that afternoon, Harriet and Jonah gathered supplies and rode back to the ranch, uncertain what they'd find. The desert seemed eerily still after the chaos of Willowbend. As they approached their property, Harriet noticed the barn's door stood ajar. Her heart lurched. She'd bolted it before leaving. Had someone forced it open? She dismounted, leaving Jonah to guard the perimeter with his rifle. Inside, the barn was in disarray. Crates were overturned, hay scattered. The trap door to the cellar was wide open, splintered at the edges as if pried from beneath. Harriet's pulse hammered in her ears. She descended the ladder. The sight below made her throat tighten. The cellar was empty. Rope lay cut on the floor. The lock she'd installed was smashed. Blood spattered the walls and floor. Possibly Silas's or Carter's. Harriet's mind reeled with possibilities. Had they escaped on their own, or had an outside rescuer intervened? She climbed back up, voice tight with alarm, as she called to Jonah. "They're gone." Jonah's eyes widened in fear. "All three," Harriet nodded. "Yes, including Lowe." Jonah cursed under his breath. But how they were sedated? Harriet shook her head, scanning the barn for clues. The footprints suggested at least 4 or 5 people had come through. Maybe some of Roth's men who fled the Willow Bend fight circled back, or Lowe managed to signal them. "I should have known he'd find a way." Jonah's mouth pressed into a grim line. "If Lowe's free, he'll come for you. For us, we need the cavalry." Harriet recalled the vow she'd made to bury Lowe's tyranny once and for all. "Yes, but if he's on the move, we might not have time to fetch help. The land between here and Fort Darrow is vast. He could slip away and rebuild his gang." She inhaled slowly, steeling her nerves. "We have to track him before he disappears." Outside, the scorching sun cast the ranch in harsh relief. Harriet spotted footprints in the dust leading away from the barn. They angled northeast toward a range of low hills. Harriet's mind flashed to rumor there was an abandoned mission in those hills, once a place of sanctuary, now rumored to house outlaws. Occasionally, possibly Lowe took refuge there. She felt an ache in her wounded arm, a reminder that she wasn't at full strength, but anger and determination fueled her. Jonah looked at her. "You're not going alone, are you?" Harriet hesitated. "I don't want you in harm's way, but I might need your help." Jonah's jaw set. "Then I'm coming. If he gets away, we'll never be safe." Harriet nodded, though a pit of dread lay in her stomach. She quickly fetched a small satchel containing a final set of vials, her most potent toxins, ones she had hoped never to use. She also took fresh water, bandages, and extra ammunition. They rode out together following the trail. Harriet's mind flipped through every tactic Lowe might employ: ambush, ransom, booby traps. She tried to calm the pounding in her chest, focusing on the methodical tracking of footprints, broken twigs, occasional drops of blood. The sun sank lower, turning the horizon a vivid orange. By the time they reached the foothills near the old mission, dusk had fallen. Harriet spied a flicker of firelight within the crumbling stone walls. She motioned for Jonah to dismount. Harriet and Jonah tethered their horses behind a stand of stunted mesquite trees. The abandoned mission loomed ahead, a silhouette of crumbling Spanish architecture. A once proud bell tower, chipped by decades of wind and neglect, jutted into the twilight sky. Harriet paused, controlling her breathing. She recalled how, as a younger woman, she'd entered burnt hospitals at night, searching for survivors among the dead and dying. This situation carried that same tension, life or death with little margin for error. They crept forward, using the mission's broken walls for cover. Jonah pointed to a faint glow coming from a partially collapsed door. The breeze carried the smell of a small campfire. Harriet signaled for silence, then peered inside. In the flickering light, she counted 3 or 4 men. One lay propped against a wall, possibly Silas, who Harriet had injured in the cellar. Carter sprawled near the fire, panting, and near them, leaning against a broken pillar, was Barrett Lowe. Recognizable even in the dimness, he appeared pale, thinner than before. Harriet suspected the toxins still lingered in his system, draining him. Yet his eyes burned with undiminished malice as he spoke in a low voice to the others. "I'm telling you," Harriet heard him say, "we have to head east by dawn. The cavalry will be looking for us. We can slip over the border if we ride fast." Silas cursed, rotating his injured shoulder. "Easier said than done. Where do we get fresh horses?" Lowe's gaze flicked to the darkness beyond the mission's open archway. "We'll steal some from the ranches if we must. Morrow's ranch might still have extras. If that meddling woman and her whelp come after us, we shoot them down. I owe that witch a slow death." Harriet felt a cold ripple in her gut. The men were injured, but still armed and capable of violence. Silently, she gestured Jonah to circle around, hoping to catch them in a crossfire if needed. She herself readied one of her special vials, the strongest irritant she had capable of, temporarily blinding everyone in close range. The plan was to stun them, seize their weapons, and ensure they couldn't flee. But Harriet hesitated, recalling her vow to Dr. Pennington not to kill them unnecessarily. She wanted them brought to trial, if that was even possible. Now Jonah moved out of sight, footsteps muffled on the sandy ground. Harriet steeled herself, mind whirling through every possible outcome. She unclasped the vial, ready to rag to ignite it. But in that moment, Carter's head snapped up. He was scanning the mission's crumbling entry like a spooked animal. Harriet froze, heart pounding. Had he sensed her presence? She ducked behind a fragment of wall, scarcely daring to breathe. Then she heard Carter speak, voice rough with anxiety. "I don't like this place." Feels cursed. "We should move now, even if it's dark." Lowe responded with a mocking snort. "Move where, genius? Half of you can barely walk." "We wait for first light." Silas spat. "I'd rather face the desert than that woman again. She's not natural the way she uses poisons. It's monstrous." Harriet felt a stab of guilt. She had become the boogeyman to them, the monstrous figure they whispered about. Maybe that was the price of living through a war that destroyed her illusions of mercy. She steadied herself, reminding her that her cause was just protecting her son, the townsfolk, and the memory of Caleb. Yet a tiny voice in her mind questioned whether the line between justice and vengeance had already been crossed. From behind the rubble, Harriet spied Jonah inching closer to a side entrance. Good they'd strike from two directions, so confusion. She ignited the rag, tied around the vial, counted 3 breaths, then lobbed it through a gap in the wall. There was a sharp pop, followed by a hiss and a billow of white smoke. Immediately shouts erupted from inside. Harriet leapt up, revolver in hand, dashing through the archway. The vapors curled around the men like a choking serpent, pulling coughs and curses from their throats. Gagging on the acrid cloud, Silas scrambled for his gun, eyes streaming. Harriet, eyes stinging, despite her partial protection, fired a warning shot into the ceiling. "Drop your weapons," she shouted, her voice echoing off ancient stone. Through the swirling irritant, she glimpsed Carter flailing. Lowe's silhouette darted sideways. Harriet spun, heart hammering. Had he vanished deeper into the mission? Jonah burst in from the opposite side, training his rifle on Carter, who was kneeling with watery eyes, sputtering. Carter's revolver clattered from his hand. Silas, coughing violently, stumbled for a second exit, but Harriet aimed her revolver at his back. "Don't move," she warned. His posture sagged in defeat. Harriet exhaled a tremulous sigh of relief. So far, no lethal shots had been fired, but Barrett Lowe was nowhere to be seen in the swirling smoke. Jonah met Harriet's eyes in alarm. She pointed to a crumbling hallway leading deeper into the mission. "He went that way." Jonah started forward, but Harriet grabbed his sleeve. "I'll go. Keep an eye on these two." Jonah looked reluctant but nodded, shoving Carter and Silas to kneel near a collapsed altar. Stepping over broken tiles, Harriet pressed into the hallway. The smoke thinned, replaced by musty air, heavy with centuries of neglect. The corridor led to small side chambers, perhaps once used for prayer or storage. Moonlight streamed through holes in the roof, revealing jagged piles of debris. Harriet scanned the darkness, every sense on high alert. The rasp of her breath sounded too loud in her ears. She clutched her revolver, half expecting Lowe to jump out from behind a pillar. The corridor ended at a small courtyard enclosed by high walls. A rotted wooden gate once led outside, now partially collapsed. Harriet paused, listening for movement. A faint crunch to her right. She pivoted, raising her gun. The courtyard's shadows were deep, but she sensed a figure there. "Lowe," she called, voice echoing. "It's over. Your men are finished," for a moment. No reply came. Then from the gloom his voice rasped. "Is it? They said that before, but I keep crawling back." Harriet advanced cautiously. Gun extended. "You're poisoned, wounded, outnumbered. Put down your weapon." A humorless chuckle drifted from the shadows. "Poisoned, yes, thanks to you. But I still have 1 bullet left." Before Harriet could react, the muzzle flash lit the darkness. She felt the bullet zing past her left ear, so close the concussion made her stagger. Reflex made her return fire. Her shot sparked against stone. She heard his footsteps, heavy and limping, crossing the courtyard. Harriet fired again into the darkness, hoping to wound, not kill. She heard him grunt. Maybe she grazed him, but he kept moving, heading for the broken gate. Heart pounding, Harriet rushed after him. The gate creaked, half jammed by rubble. Lowe cursed as he fought to squeeze through Harriet. closed the distance determined to end this. She aimed, but in the faint moonlight, she saw he had turned to face her gun, raised unsteadily. She ducked behind an old statue base just as he fired. Dust exploded around her, peppering her arms with grit. Harriet cursed under her breath. Lowe had become a cornered animal, unstoppable until put down for good. She reached for her satchel, realizing she had only one more specialized weapon, left her strongest toxin in liquid form, typically meant for sabotage of water sources. Using it in combat was unorthodox, but Harriet had no time to think. She uncorked the small vial, saturating her handkerchief with the fluid. Then she rose, flinging herself at Lowe. The movement was insane, she knew, but a bullet-laden standoff would only risk her own life further. Lowe roared in surprise as Harriet collided with him, her bandaged arm throbbing with pain. He tried to bring his gun around, but Harriet jammed the soaked handkerchief against his mouth and nose, forcing him to inhale the powerful chemical. In the scuffle, he squeezed off a wild shot, scorching Harriet's side with a grazing wound. She cried out in pain. Summoning the last of her strength, she clung to him like a predator, ensuring he swallowed those toxic fumes. The pair stumbled back into the courtyard's moonlight, locked in a desperate clinch. Harriet felt Lowe's body convulse as the toxin flooded his lungs, attacking the mucous membranes and forcing his body toward paralysis. His eyes bulged in sheer hatred. He battered her side with a free hand, ripping a cry from her throat. Harriet clung on, ignoring the warm blood trickling from the graze until she sensed his muscles slacken. Then she wrenched away, sagging to her knees, breathing in sharp, ragged gulps. Lowe collapsed, twitching and coughing foam. The chemical Harriet used was not meant as a quick killer, more a disabling agent in higher concentrations, but combined with the remnants of poison in his bloodstream, it might be lethal. Harriet crawled across the dusty ground, fumbling for her revolver. Lowe lay on his back chest, heaving, eyes rolling with delirium. Harriet's stomach lurched at the sight. She might have wanted him dead for murdering Caleb, terrorizing Jonah and harming countless innocents. Yet the memory of her oath tugged at her. She was no mere executioner. If he died, so be it, but if he lived, Harriet decided he'd face justice, in a lawful sense. Jonah arrived, footsteps pounding on stone. Ma, he knelt, eyes wide with alarm at Harriet's bleeding side. "You're hurt." Harriet shook her head, gesturing to Lowe. "Check him." Jonah, face pale, leaned over Lowe's convulsing form. "He's still breathing, but—" Harriet fought the urge to pass out. "We tie him up. Get him back to Willowbend or Fort Darrow. Let him stand trial this time." "No more half measures." Jonah nodded, tears threatening to spill. He pulled a length of rope from his belt. Harriet forced herself to stand, leaning on a crumbling column, ignoring the throbbing pain in her side. She stared at Lowe's prone form. Even like this, he was dangerous. She felt no triumph, only the numb exhaustion of a soldier who has lived through too many nights of violence. Jonah quickly bound Lowe's arms and legs, then turned to Harriet, pressing a makeshift cloth against her wound. She winced. "We'll need to get me stitched up. We have to handle Silas and Carter, too." They trudged back to the main hall of the mission, where Carter and Silas were still reeling from Harriet's irritant. Jonah had them under guard. Harriet, summoning her last scraps of strength, helped Jonah retrieve a battered handcart from a corner of the courtyard. With considerable effort, they loaded Lowe onto it. The entire time, Harriet's mind swirled with half-formed thoughts. Could she truly keep him alive this time? Did he deserve it? She thought of Dr. Pennington's hopeful face in Willowbend and decided yes, if only for the sake of something better than more killing. By the time they emerged from the mission, dawn was cresting the horizon. Harriet's side burned, her arm felt stiff, and the rest of her body ached. Jonah, weary but resolute, led their two captured outlaws, Carter and Silas, on foot. Lowe remained lashed to the cart, every so often uttering a broken moan. The desert wind whistled through the mission's weathered arches, as if in farewell to a final night of ghosts and violence. They trudged across sandy terrain, Harriet leaning on Jonah's shoulder to keep from collapsing. Her vision blurred from blood loss and pain. Carter occasionally tried to break free, but Jonah threatened to club him with the rifle's butt if he tried. Silas, face contorted by an earlier bullet wound, staggered sullenly. None spoke. The desert silence was broken only by Harriet's labored breathing and the squeak of the cart's wheels. After an hour, they reached a small spring-fed watering hole, a place Harriet recognized from her earlier reconnaissance. Grateful for the chance to rest, she motioned Jonah to stop. She sank to her knees by the water, wincing at the sting in her side. Jonah rummaged in Harriet's satchel, pulling out bandages. She guided his hands in making a rudimentary dressing. The wound wasn't too deep, but it throbbed painfully. Harriet forced down a wave of dizziness. "We should get to Willowben," she murmured. "Pennington can patch me properly." Carter glared at Harriet. "You'll never make it. You're as good as dead, same as us. Might as well let us go." Harriet ignored him, sipping water from a cupped hand. She used a small portion to flush out her own wound, biting back a cry at the sting. In her delirium, she flashed to images of the war men screaming under her scalpel, begging for relief. She remembered the numb competence that had seen her through so many surgeries. Now she had to muster that same focus for herself. Jonah refilled canteens, dividing water carefully. Harriet checked on Lowe, who lay half-conscious, eyes rolling. She touched a hand to his brow, feverish but still breathing. The toxin had done its work, leaving him too weak to fight back. "You should have finished me," he muttered. Harriet's voice came out hoarse. "Perhaps. But then I'd be like you." He coughed a laugh. "You already are, Morrow. I see it in your eyes." She felt Jonah's hand on her shoulder. "Don't listen to him. Let's keep moving." Harriet nodded, though she trembled from fatigue. Step by step, they continued forging on. The sun climbed high, punishing them with searing rays. Harriet's vision dimmed at the edges. She forced herself to remain upright, repeating a silent mantra. The clinic, the cavalry, then rest. Finally, in late afternoon, the outskirts of Willowben came into view. The ragtag party must have made quite a sight, Harriet limping. Jonah leading two bound outlaws, a half-dead Barrett Lowe on a cart. Townsfolk, seeing them approach, rushed out in alarm. Dr. Pennington arrived swiftly, exclaiming in concern when he saw Harriet's condition. "Get her to the surgery," he ordered. While Harriet was lifted from her horse, she gestured feebly at Lowe. Under guard, she mumbled, "Don't let him escape." Pennington assured her they'd lock the men in the jail, reinforced with cavalry oversight. Harriet's eyelids drooped. She felt hands guiding her to a cot, the world spinning in and out of focus. The last thing she heard was Jonah's voice. "Please, doctor. Save her." A day later, Harriet awoke in a haze of opiate-induced rest, blinking at the clinic's whitewashed ceiling. She heard muffled voices beyond the door. Pain flared in her side with each breath, but she felt stabilized. Slowly, she recognized Dr. Pennington's office, the new, albeit partially finished clinic. Willowben had started constructing. The smell of antiseptic replaced the desert dust. Harriet let her gaze wander. On a nearby table, she saw an array of bandages, scalpels, and tinctures, some of which she had formulated herself. Jonah must have sensed her stirring because he burst into the room, relief shining on his face. "My, you're awake." Harriet tried to speak, her throat dry. Jonah offered a cup of water. She drank greedily, then rasped low. Jonah settled beside her, exhaling. Behind bars, Pennington's had the cavalry guard them around the clock. Lowe, Silas Carter. The rest of the surviving raiders, including Gideon Roth, are also locked up or recovering from injuries. The cavalry is preparing to transfer them to Fort Darrow for a full tribunal. Harriet felt a wave of relief that nearly brought tears. It was over, or so it seemed. She had survived, Jonah was safe, and the Iron Strike raiders were in custody. Groping for Jonah's hand, she squeezed it. "Thank you for saving me back there," she whispered. Jonah's lips curved into a trembling smile. "You saved me first, countless times over the next hours." Harriet rested, drifting in and out of sleep. Dr. Pennington explained that he'd removed the bullet fragment, stitched her side, and administered laudanum to help with the pain. She'd need time to heal fully. Harriet accepted it gratefully, content that for once the burden of medical heroics wasn't on her shoulders. Townsfolk trickled in with cautious well-wishes, leaving baskets of food or small tokens of gratitude. Harriet sensed their admiration was tinged with fear. Her reputation as the woman who used poison to topple an outlaw gang preceded her. 2 days later, Harriet was strong enough to walk around the clinic yard with Jonah's help. She observed battered buildings being rebuilt, citizens working together to repair a sense of normalcy. There was talk of the cavalry escorting the raiders to Fort Darrow soon. "I'd like to see them off," Harriet told Jonah. "I need to be sure Barrett Lowe boards that wagon." On a crisp morning, Harriet returned to Willow Bend's modest jail, escorted by Jonah and Dr. Pennington. The cavalry had loaded most of the prisoners into wagons. Harriet's heart thumped as she neared the cell that held Barrett Lowe. She found him slumped on a bench behind iron bars, his expression hollow. The toxins had run their course, leaving him malnourished and drained, but he still managed a venomous glare when Harriet approached. So he croaked, "This is the triumphant hero come to gloat." Harriet shook her head, surprising herself with the calm that settled over her. "I'm no hero," she replied softly. "I did terrible things to stop you." Lowe's lips twisted. "You'll be remembered in dime novels as the poison widow or some nonsense. Meanwhile, I'll hang or rot in a cell." Harriet swallowed. "If that's justice, so be it. You've killed too many, robbed, too many ruined, too many lives." A cavalry sergeant unlocked the cell, roughly hauling Lowe to his feet. He winced but refused to cry out. Harriet stepped aside, feeling the swirl of conflicting emotions: relief, sorrow, finality. She thought of Caleb. Jonah's father remembered the day he was shot dead near their well. Harriet inhaled slowly. "I'm not asking your forgiveness," she told Lowe, "but I'm done letting you take anything else from us." Lowe sneered. "I never asked for your mercy." Harriet nodded, a lump in her throat. "And you won't have it," she said quietly. With that, the cavalry led him away, shackled and beaten. Silas and Carter followed in another wagon, haggard and subdued. Harriet felt Jonah's hand on her shoulder, giving a reassuring squeeze. Dr. Pennington watched in silence, understanding better than anyone the moral burden Harriet carried. As the wagons rolled out, Harriet realized how exhausted she was. She'd spent so many months scheming, poisoning, fighting, and surviving. Now, with the raiders gone, the impetus that fueled her nightmares had finally lifted. On the edge of the departing crowd, Helena Henderson and Mayor Eckhart approached Harriet. The mayor cleared his throat. "Mrs. Morrow, the people of Willow Bend are in your debt. We'd like to offer an official statement of thanks. Perhaps hold a ceremony." Harriet raised a hand gently. "I appreciate the sentiment, but I'd rather we let the town move on. If you truly want to honor my family, help Jonah build that water project he's designed. Something that betters all our lives." Mayor Eckhart blinked, then smiled. "Yes, of course. We'll discuss that in the next council meeting." Harriet returned a small nod. Inside, relief mingled with a hollow sense of mourning. Could she ever fully cast off the role she'd played? She turned to Dr. Pennington. "I should go home, see if the ranch is still in one piece." Pennington nodded. "Give yourself time to heal. You always rushed around in the war. Harriet, rest is also part of medicine." Harriet managed a ghost of a smile. "Thank you for everything." Jonah helped her onto a borrowed horse. Her own was stabled near the clinic. Together they rode slowly out of Willow Bend, leaving the battered jail and saloon behind. The morning sun lit their path with a gentle warmth that contrasted sharply with the violence of recent nights. Back at the Morrow Ranch, Harriet found the barn still showing signs of forced entry. She and Jonah spent a couple of days making repairs. The trap door to the cellar had been torn apart, so Harriet filled it in, deciding she wanted no more secret compartments. She burned the wooden splinters that had once covered the entrance, feeling a strange catharsis in eliminating the hiding place for her toxins. During the quiet nights, Harriet revisited her journals of chemical formulas. Many pages detailed poisons, sedatives, ways to manipulate water supplies. She recalled how she'd developed them not out of malice but necessity, yet the cost weighed heavily. Setting a lantern on her desk, Harriet began copying the lethal sections into a separate sheaf of notes. Once done, she carried them outside to a small fire pit. Jonah stood by silent as Harriet fed page after page to the flames. The war was over, at least for her. Time to lay that part of her life to rest. When Harriet dropped the last page in, she said softly, "Your father told me once, we live by the water, but we shouldn't drown in it. I think I almost drowned in my own poison." Jonah reached for her hand. "But you saved a lot of people too." Harriet's mouth tightened. "Yes, and I damned myself in the process. Perhaps now I can find redemption in rebuilding." Jonah nodded, voice quiet. "I was offered a chance to oversee a new irrigation project in Willow Bend. They need better systems, especially with the damage done by the raiders. Harriet felt her heart lift slightly. You should do it. That's good, honest work. Jonah gave her a tender smile. I want you to be part of it, Mom. You have the botanical knowledge. Together we can cultivate new crops, new medicines. Harriet's eyes misted. All right, she whispered, let's do it. For the first time in months, she felt hope more strongly than fear. Weeks passed. The cavalry confirmed Barrett Lowe and the surviving raiders faced a full tribunal at Fort Darrow. Word reached Harriet that Silas tried to blame everything on Lowe, but evidence stacked high against them all. Harriet refused the invitation to testify. She'd already said her piece in a written statement. By then, her priorities were at home, caring for the ranch, working with Jonah, and reestablishing normalcy. One afternoon, a writer brought news that Lowe had died in jail awaiting trial. Harriet read the message, a pang striking her chest. She'd never wanted him to die unpunished by the law, but fate had other ideas. Jonah found her by the fence line, the note fluttering in her hand. Are you okay? He asked softly. Harriet stared at the horizon, recalling all the sleepless nights spent plotting Lowe's downfall. I'm relieved, she admitted. It means no more escapes, no more fear. But I also feel empty. The fight consumed me for so long. Autumn arrived in a burst of warm days and cooler nights. Harriet threw herself into the irrigation project, assisting Jonah in designing channels that would share the ranch's water with Willowbend. Over several weeks, volunteers from town joined them, digging ditches, placing pipes, forging new pathways for the life-giving flow. Harriet studied the soil, selecting desert-tolerant herbs to cultivate. She used her knowledge of plant properties to help Dr. Pennington develop new medicines that would treat frontier illnesses without needing advanced city supplies. As Harriet's wound healed, she discovered a new joy in simple tasks: testing soil pH, carefully watering seedlings, writing notes in a fresh journal about healing balms instead of deadly toxins. The nightmares eased slightly, though she'd still wake sometimes expecting to see the Iron Strike Raiders storming her ranch. Each time Jonah would reassure her they were safe, that the cavalry still patrolled the region. Harriet reminded herself that the desert was wide, but so was the resilience of the people in Willowbend. In mid-October, the town held a modest harvest fair, a chance to forget the violence and celebrate life. Harriet and Jonah attended, showcasing some herbal remedies. Townsfolk gave Harriet a respectful berth, still unsure how to approach the woman who had single-handedly orchestrated a gang's downfall. But children giggled at Jonah's demonstration of a model windmill, pumping water from a small trough. Harriet found herself smiling at their wonder. Even if some people remained cautious around her, she was no longer the lonely widow consumed by vengeance. As the fair wound down, Helena Henderson approached Harriet with a wooden box in her hands. We made this for you, Helena said softly, lifting the lid. Inside lay a delicate plaque engraved, in gratitude to Harriet Morrow, who defended our town and guided us to renewal. Harriet's throat tightened. I can't accept a tribute like that. I used methods that many would condemn. Helena nodded, tears in her eyes. Some do. But more of us remember that you were willing to risk your own life to save ours, to free us from men who had no mercy. We want you to know your actions weren't in vain. Harriet swallowed her gaze, drifting to the swirling crowds, the laughter, the clink of cider glasses. She reached out and touched the plaque's polished surface. Thank you. By the end of the fair, Harriet felt a stirring of contentment she hadn't known in years. Despite the scars, literal and figurative, she sensed a future that wasn't stained by blood or overshadowed by outlaws. Perhaps she couldn't undo all the things she'd done, but she could shape a better tomorrow. Another month slipped by, each day bringing Harriet closer to the life she used to imagine with Caleb, though without him by her side. The new irrigation system functioned beyond expectations, greening patches of desert near Willowbend. Jonah beamed each time fresh water trickled into a parched field. Harriet found satisfaction in seeing the land heal, echoing her own slow mending. Dr. Pennington often dropped by to share developments in medicine, forging a new partnership with Harriet that recalled their war-era collaboration, only this time aimed at growth rather than survival. Late one evening, Harriet stood outside the ranch house, gazing at the stars. The memory of Caleb lingered in the silhouette of the well, the faint glow of the lantern. She wondered how he would see her now, a woman who had used both healing and poisoning to protect their home, who had survived repeated showdowns with killers. Would he be proud or horrified? Jonah appeared beside her, arms folded. "Ma, are you all right? You've been out here a while." Harriet nodded slowly, exhaling a soft breath. "I was just remembering, so much has changed, but you and I are still here." Jonah placed an arm around her shoulders and will keep going. "There's talk of building a small school in Willowbend. The irrigation is helping more families settle. The place is growing. They want you to help teach about herbal medicine." Harriet smiled faintly, a touch of humility warming her cheeks. "Me, a teacher, I'd never have thought." Jonah leaned his head against hers. "They trust you, Ma, despite everything. Or maybe because of it, you've proven you'll do whatever it takes to keep people alive." Harriet's eyes burned with unshed tears. "I just hope it no longer requires poison or bullets." With the night sky as her witness, Harriet let herself feel a sense of peace. The fight against the Iron Strike Raiders, culminating in the downfall of Barrett Lowe, was finally behind them. She didn't kid herself that the frontier was free of evil. Others might rise in other corners. But Harriet Morrow had done enough. Her war was over, replaced by a mission to nurture life. And in that transformation, Harriet found the faint glimmer of true redemption. A year after the final showdown, Willowbend was nearly unrecognizable compared to the battered town Harriet had first encountered. New buildings stood proudly, fresh coats of paint gleaming in the sunlight. The irrigation ditches Jonah devised laced the fields around town with trickling streams, encouraging farmers to plant with renewed hope. Herds of livestock drank from troughs that no longer fell under extortion by a gang of outlaws. The newly finished Willowbend Clinic opened its doors, a 2-room building with wide windows and sturdy construction. A small brass plaque near the entrance read, "Dedicated to all who heal and protect." Harriet had resisted attempts to name it after her, preferring an inclusive dedication that honored Dr. Pennington Jonah and the many townsfolk who contributed. On the opening day, Harriet stood beside Dr. Pennington, greeting visitors, her bandaged side long healed into a scar that only she noticed. Mayor Eckhart offered a few ceremonial words, praising the shift from violence to community growth. Harriet felt uneasy during the speech, yet appreciative of the calm future it implied. After the ceremony, Harriet guided curious residents through the clinic's modest lab. Shelves displayed jars of dried herbs, salves, and labeled tinctures she'd made from the desert's flora this time, geared toward fevers, coughs, and infections rather than sabotage. "This is echinacea," Harriet explained to a wide-eyed child. "It helps your body fight illness." She handed the child's father a pamphlet on first aid. She found unexpected joy in sharing knowledge that healed rather than harmed. That day ended with a quiet satisfaction Harriet hadn't felt in years. That night, she sat on the clinic porch under the glow of an oil lamp, journaling her new discoveries about desert plants. She closed her ledger and allowed herself to remember the darkest times, her infiltration of Canyon del Hierro's water supply, the chemical bombs in Willowbend, the final skirmish at the mission. She wondered if she would ever fully escape the ghosts of those moments. Yet seeing the clinic's warm light spill across the threshold, Harriet felt she had chosen at last to live, rather than merely survive. Jonah stepped onto the porch carrying a small wrapped parcel. "Look what Helena Henderson sent," he said, unwrapping it to reveal a carved wooden figure of a mother and child. The words "thank you" etched beneath. Harriet took it throat, tightening with gratitude. She stroked the smooth wood, which reminded her of the closeness she shared with Jonah, a bond forged in fire and tempered by love. As the lamp guttered low, Harriet closed her eyes and inhaled the desert night. The new path she walked, less about vengeance, more about caretaking, felt fragile yet vital. She had chosen to fight like a demon to protect her son and her home. But now she chose to let that demon rest, replaced by the quiet determination of a healer. When the final glow of the lamp winked out, Harriet pictured the future, a community building itself around clean water, shared knowledge, and resilience. The Iron Strike Raiders had kidnapped her son, threatened her land, and awakened her darkest talents. Yet here in the aftermath, Harriet and Jonah had forged something stronger than fear. In the end, Martha Hargrave's incredible stand against the Ruthless gang wasn't just about vengeance, it was about redemption, resilience, and the enduring strength of family. Through grit and determination, she transformed her loss into hope, reviving a community once gripped by fear. Her battle reminds us of timeless American values: courage under fire, integrity against corruption, and protecting what matters most at all costs. Her son Thomas emerged stronger and wiser, inspired by his mother's bravery to rebuild their legacy on a foundation of justice and honor. Now it's your turn. Tell us what you thought of Martha's extraordinary journey. Would you have taken justice into your own hands? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe to catch more powerful stories celebrating courage, resilience, and true grit on the American frontier.